visiting different congregations in the area. So you have either the good or bad fortune, I don't know, for me to be here. So I'm grateful. I serve at the seminary, and I'm the associate professor of Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim Relations. I've been at the seminary about 6 years, and before that, my family and I served with the Unit for Global Mission of the ELCA in Cairo, Egypt. We were there for 10 years. We raised our 3 kids there, and when we came back, they came to a new country, and they're not quite sure about this place they call the United States. Nevertheless, so I'm glad to be with you today. This lesson that we have in the Gospel, as I said, is the longest conversation that Jesus has with anyone recorded in the Gospels. It's the longest narrative, the longest dialogue. And given exactly who the person is that Jesus is talking with, our Gospel writer, John, is trying to tell us something very important. Imagine, if you will, it was high noon. The sun was scorching the rocky hills of Samaria. It was so hot that by the time you perspired, the beads of sweat had evaporated off your arms and your forehead. I remember those days in Egypt. But it's a dry heat. It's the kind of day, though, that you could dehydrate very quickly. You wouldn't last long out under the sun, especially without water. And so Jesus and his disciples, traveling through Samaria, this forbidden countryside, was the place where the Samaritans lived. They were the people that the Jews considered to be heretics. They had a different Torah scroll. They had different laws. They didn't worship in Jerusalem. They didn't orient themselves toward the temple, but toward Mount Gerizim. Jesus happens upon the well, this ancient well attributed to Jacob. And as he comes up to the well, he finds a lone woman, a Samaritan woman, and politely and hospitably begins a conversation with her. Perhaps it's not such an unusual cultural event for us. But in Jesus' culture and in this time, it was extraordinary. He's thirsty. And there she is, the one with the only utensil or method for getting water out of the well, a deep well. It was probably not a clay jar like you have in your bulletin, because if you drop the clay jar down the well and it hit the side, so much for that. It was probably more like a water skin, animal skin, used to retrieve the water. He didn't have one. She had the utensil. So I suppose if he was dying of thirst, regardless of who it was, he probably had to be nice to her to get some water. But Jesus' encounter with her is a very unusual occurrence. It's extraordinary. In fact, it's a scandal for the disciples. It was a scandal for his own Jewish community, and probably, I imagine, it was a scandal for the first Christians who heard this gospel. There are several things here that make this meeting so extraordinary and so scandalous. First, it happens at noon. The daily routine of household chores took place beginning first thing in the morning, even before the sun had risen, where mostly women at that time would go out to the well, and there they would fill up their water, buckets, jars, skins, whatever you call them, to take back to their homes so that they would have water throughout the day. They didn't have taps, they didn't have plumbing, they didn't have running water. So all the water they needed, they had to go to the well. And you went to the well first thing in the morning because you needed water all day, but primarily because it was cool enough in the morning to go get the water. So why was this woman coming out at high noon, the hottest part of the day? Why wouldn't she have been there early in the morning? Maybe she overslept. Maybe she forgot. I doubt it. Gathering water at the well was also a social event. Everyone went at the same time, primarily the women, as I mentioned. And they would gather around and they would share the stories and the news of their families and of the village. It was kind of like your own coffee clutch, if you have those. Maybe like gathering at Starbucks. This is where they caught up on the news of the village. So why wasn't this woman a part of that? In all likelihood, she was an outcast. We find out later in the story that the woman had 5 husbands. Jewish law only allowed a woman to marry 3 times at the most. If the woman's husband died or she was divorced, she could remarry, but only up to 3 times. So she had broken the law. Perhaps this was why she wasn't welcome. Perhaps this was why everyone in town talked about her behind her back. Perhaps this was the reason why she wasn't welcome in their midst. Our sister in the story was forced to come to the well by herself at noon, at the hottest part of the day. And it wasn't by her own choosing. The second reason that this story is so extraordinary and scandalous is that here Jesus, a man, a rabbi nevertheless, finds nothing wrong at all in addressing and conversing with this strange woman. Again, perhaps not so extraordinary in our culture, but the text says when the disciples found out that Jesus was talking to this woman, they were astonished. Perhaps a better translation in the New Testament Greek would have been, they were shocked. They were shocked. In Middle Eastern cultures, from antiquity even to today, gender roles are very clear. And for the most part, genders are segregated. Even among the most progressive and open Protestant Christian communities in the Middle East, male and females are fairly well segregated in public spaces, and especially in worship. Men on one side, women on another. A man does not speak to a strange woman in public. Third, if it isn't enough that he's already talking to a strange woman at noon, he's talking to a Samaritan woman. Samaritans were considered the outcasts, the heretics. John tells us that Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. Perhaps it would have been better to read something like, they would not even be in the same room together. They would not share the same place or location as Samaritans. They wouldn't associate with them. They wouldn't go near them. And they certainly wouldn't drink out of a bucket of water. Jews did not consort with Samaritans. So it makes the parable of the Good Samaritan in the Gospel of Luke so powerful. You remember the story from Luke, the parable of the Good Samaritan? How the man who's beaten on the side of the road is happened upon by the Good Samaritan who helps him. No self-respecting Jew in the first century would ever think a Samaritan to be good. So not only does Jesus break social rule number 1, speaking to an outcast, social rule number 2, speaking to an unknown woman, but social rule number 3, this Samaritan. Jesus approaches this untouchable, this unacceptable person from this first century Jewish perspective, and engages her in a deeply moving and deeply touching conversation about her life, her past, her present, and her future. And he offers her something much more than simply water, simply physical nourishment. He offers her living, breathing water, life-giving water, meaning in her life. Now, in a land where there's little rainfall or snow that melts into the rivers and lakes, the provision of water makes all the difference between life and death. So life-giving water means a great deal. And she responds. She recognizes that this is a special man, a rabbi, a prophet, a Messiah. Jesus demonstrates here that no person, no people, there is no one to whom he does not go, to whom he will not reach out to whom he will not engage, to whom he will not have a deep conversation about life. Jesus, his openness, his ability to cross this strict boundary of his day between gender, between ethnicity, between religion, provides a model for us about what God does for us. Paul says in Romans, "But God proves his love for us that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Paul reminds us that Christ came for us. No matter who we are, no matter what we may have done, no matter how unclean or ashamed we may feel, no matter what our past, no matter what others may think of us and who we are, Jesus comes to us. Jesus comes to you and says, "Would you like a drink of water? Would you like to be made new again?" This is the power that God has in our baptisms to wipe us clean, that we might start over. Jesus raises this woman's past, but he doesn't dwell on it. He's interested in her future. Jesus is interested in your future, in your life, in making you new. So in these days of Lent, as we walk along with Jesus to Jerusalem, what has your conversation been with him? Amen.